She turned down his money in the alley and asked him for the truth instead. 18 years later, she turned down a plea deal and asked the courtroom for the same thing. Some debts don't get settled in dollars. Some get settled in years, in silence, in a leather folder carried through doors no one thought would ever open to her. Stephen Waller had built his name the way most careful men build anything that lasts, slowly and mostly out of sight. By the time he was 40, half the ports on the eastern seaboard moved something through his hands without knowing his name, and the half that did know it never said it above a whisper. He didn't deal in spectacle. Spectacle got you noticed, and getting noticed got you dead or indicted, usually in that order. He dealt in quiet arrangements, in men who owed him favors they'd spend a lifetime repaying, in problems that disappeared without a headline attached. His enemies called him careful. His few friends called him patient. Everyone agreed that whatever you called it, you didn't want to be on the wrong side of it. That kind of reputation costs something to maintain, and that October it was costing him a distributor named Halloran, a man who'd started asking questions about a shipment that wasn't his business to ask about, and who'd made the mistake of asking them to the wrong people. The conversation Stephen had with him under the flickering light of the loading dock off 9th Street lasted 6 minutes, and ended the way these things ended when he handled them personally, without raised voices, without witnesses, without anything a jury would ever get the chance to examine. He walked away from it the same man he'd been walking in. That was the part people never understood about men like him. It didn't cost you anything you could see. The rain had been coming down since noon, the cold, mean kind that got under a collar and stayed there, and by the time Stephen was heading back to the car it had turned to something closer to sleet. He had his head down, his mind already 3 moves ahead on a different problem, when a sound stopped him, small, human, trying hard not to be heard and failing. He almost kept walking. That was the part he'd think about later, on nights when sleep didn't come easy. He almost kept walking. She was wedged into the gap between a dumpster and the brick wall behind it, knees pulled to her chest, soaked through to something that no longer looked like clothing so much as a second skin. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. When she looked up at him, there was no fear in her face, which unsettled him more than fear would have. There was arithmetic. She was measuring him, his size, his coat, the distance to the street, the way you'd measure a threat you already assumed was coming. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, and heard, even as he said it, how little that sentence was worth coming from a stranger in an alley at midnight. She didn't answer, didn't move. He crouched down anyway, close enough now to see that her lips had gone the color of the concrete around her. Some part of him that he didn't examine too closely reached into his coat and came out with a fold of cash, more than she'd likely seen in her life, and held it toward her like that would fix anything. She looked at the money the way you'd look at something dangerous. "I don't want that. Take it." "I don't want your money," she said, and her voice had a flatness to it that made her sound older than her face. "I want food. Real food. Not something you hand out so you can feel better about yourself and go home and forget you saw me." He didn't have an answer ready. That alone should have told him something was different about this night, because Stephen Waller always had an answer ready. It was the one thing 30 years in his line of work guaranteed you, whether you wanted it or not. He never got the chance to find one. 2 men came around the corner of the loading dock, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that told you they'd done this before, seen a kid alone somewhere she shouldn't be, and clocked her as an opportunity. One of them reached for her arm before he'd even finished closing the distance. Stephen moved, without deciding to. It was over in less time than it takes to describe it. Both men on the wet pavement, one of them not getting back up right away, the other deciding very quickly that he had somewhere else to be. It wasn't heroism. It was 30 years of reflex wearing heroism's coat for one night, and he knew the difference even if no one watching would have. The girl hadn't flinched through any of it. She watched the whole thing with the same still, cataloging expression she'd given him from the start, like she was filing it away as one more piece of evidence in a case she was building against the world. "You're not a good man," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, delivered the way you'd knowed it was still raining. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." He should have walked away then. Every instinct that had kept him alive and free for 3 decades was telling him to walk away then, to leave the money on the ground if she wouldn't take it, get in the car, and let the city do to her whatever the city was going to do. Instead, he heard himself say something he hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't run through the way he ran through everything. Come with me. Not for tonight. For good. She stared at him a long moment, still running the numbers, and for the first time since he'd found her, he had no idea which way they'd come out. The house Sherry moved into had the kind of quiet that came from money, not peace. Marble floors that showed every footprint until someone quietly wiped them clean again. Art on the walls she was fairly sure cost more than the shelter she'd been sleeping behind. Men at the doors who didn't introduce themselves, didn't smile, and moved through the halls like they'd been trained never to be noticed, which, she understood within her first week, they had been. She was given a room on the 3rd floor, far from Stephen's study and farther still from whatever happened in the East Wing after the staff went home. Nobody told her that in so many words. She worked it out the way she worked out most things. By watching, by listening at doors that were supposed to be closed, by noticing which conversations stopped the moment she walked into a room and which ones didn't bother. The men who worked for Stephen didn't know what to do with her. She could feel it in the way they went stiff and formal whenever she passed, the careful blankness they put on like it was part of the uniform. A 10-year-old girl in a house built around men who solved problems with their hands was not a variable any of them had planned for. One of them, a broad, quiet man named Reyes who guarded the front hall most nights, started leaving a plate of food outside her door when the kitchen staff forgot dinner, which happened more than it should have in that first month. He never said a word about it. She never said a word back. It was the closest thing to a friendship the house offered her for a long time. Stephen, for his part, drew lines the way he drew everything, decisively and without much room for negotiation. She was not to go past the 2nd floor after 9 at night. She was not to answer the private line in the study, ever, under any circumstance, even if it rang for an hour. She was not to be in the room when certain men came to see him, and there was never any need to explain which men, because the house itself seemed to shift when they arrived, a change in air pressure she learned to read before she understood what it meant. "This isn't your business," he told her once early on, when she'd wandered too close to a meeting and been steered out by one of his men with a gentleness that still felt like a wall going up. "It's never going to be your business. That's the deal." "Nobody asked me if I wanted a deal." "No," he agreed. "Nobody did. That's how deals like this work." She hated him for it in the specific, silent way children hate the adults who are right. Because even at 10, even furious about being managed, some part of her understood that the wall he was building wasn't really about keeping her out. It was about keeping something in, keeping whatever he was from reaching her, the way you'd keep a fire from spreading by cutting a line through the brush ahead of it. It didn't stop her from testing the wall constantly. She learned the layout of the house faster than anyone expected, learned which stairwell let her hear the study without being seen from it, learned to ask questions sideways so the answers came out before anyone noticed what she'd been building toward. By the time she was 11, she'd pieced together enough, a name here, a shipment mentioned there, the particular hush that fell over the kitchen staff whenever a certain black car pulled into the drive, to understand, in outline if not in detail, what kind of house she was actually living in. She never told him what she knew.
Not yet.
She filed it the way she filed everything, quietly, without comment, watching to see what he'd do if he found out she'd figured it out on her own. What surprised her, in that first strange year, wasn't the violence she sensed at the edges of the house. She'd grown up close enough to violence to recognize its shape from a distance, the way you recognize weather before it arrives. What surprised her was the care. The way Stephen checked, without fail, that she'd eaten before he had. The way he stood in her doorway some nights, not saying anything, just making sure she was actually asleep and not lying awake cataloging the house's secrets in the dark. The way his men, gruff and unreadable as they were, had started treating her less like an intrusion and more like something the house was now built around, whether they'd agreed to it or not. She didn't call him anything yet. Not father, not by name, mostly nothing at all, addressed sideways the way she addressed everything she wasn't ready to commit to. But she stopped flinching when his hand landed on her shoulder in passing. She stopped sleeping with her shoes by the bed, ready to run. And on the nights when the house went quiet and the black car didn't come, when it was just the two of them at a table too large for two people, She let herself notice, just briefly, that the walls he kept building around her weren't cages. They were the first thing in her life anyone had ever built to keep her safe. The trouble started the way trouble usually started in Stephen's world, quietly, at first, in places he wasn't looking. A shipment came up short off the Jersey docks, then another, and the men responsible for the second one turned out to work for a rival operation out of Baltimore that had spent the better part of a year deciding Stephen Waller had gotten comfortable, and comfortable men made mistakes worth exploiting. He didn't think much of it at first. Territorial noise was as old as the business itself, a kind of weather he'd learned to work around rather than through. It stopped being weather the night a car he didn't recognize sat outside the house for 40 minutes before one of his men finally ran the plates. He never told Sherry what the plates came back to. He didn't need to. She was 13 by then, sharp enough to read the shift in the house the same way she'd learned to read every other change in pressure since she'd arrived. The extra men at the gate, the new locks on the study door, the way Reyes started walking her the short distance from the car to the front steps even though the distance had never required an escort before. She asked him about it once, directly, the way she asked about everything. "Somebody's angry with you." "Somebody's always angry with me." "It's not new." "It's new enough that there are 2 more guards at the gate than there were last month." He didn't answer that one, which was its own kind of answer, and she filed it away with everything else she'd learned not to push on until she had more to work with. What she didn't know, what he made sure she never found out, not from him and not from anyone else in the house, was how close it had actually come. A name had surfaced in a conversation he'd had with a man from Baltimore, a name meant as a message rather than a threat, though the line between the two had never been especially wide in his line of work. The message was simple enough. They knew about the girl. They knew where she went to school, what time she left in the mornings, which corner she waited on when the car was running late. It wasn't a threat yet. It was information, offered the way you'd show someone a hand of cards before you decided whether to play them. Stephen sat with that for 3 days before he said anything to her, and when he finally did, it wasn't the conversation she was expecting. "There's a school in Vermont," he said at dinner in the same tone he used for anything he'd already decided and wasn't going to be talked out of. "Good one. Better than anything in the city, and further from anything in the city, too." She put her fork down slowly. "You're sending me away. I'm sending you somewhere safe. Those aren't the same thing." "They are tonight," he said, and something in his voice told her this wasn't a line she was going to be allowed to argue past, no matter how many angles she tried it from. She tried anyway because that was who she was. Pointed out that running was exactly the kind of move that made you look weak to people who were already circling, that leaving her defenseless in a state he didn't control was a strange way to keep her safe, that she'd rather know what she was up against than be shipped somewhere and told nothing. He listened to all of it with the patience of a man who'd already made peace with the decision before he'd opened his mouth, and when she finished, he only said one thing back. "I didn't pull you out of that alley, so you could end up back in one. That's the whole reason. There isn't a second one." She didn't have an answer for that. It was the first time in 3 years she hadn't had an answer ready, and the silence that followed sat between them longer than either of them wanted it to. He drove her to the airport himself, no driver, no escort, just the two of them, and a car full of things he didn't know how to say out loud. At the gate, he told her the things fathers were supposed to tell their daughters, that she'd call every Sunday, that she'd have everything she needed, that this wasn't a punishment and wasn't goodbye, just distance, and distance wasn't the same as leaving. She nodded through all of it with the particular stillness she used when she decided not to cry in front of someone. "You could just tell me the truth," she said, right before she went through the gate. "Whatever it is. I'm not a kid who needs protecting from information anymore." "You'll always be the kid I found under that rain," he said. "That's not up for negotiation either." She left without saying anything else. He stood at the window until her plane had cleared the runway, long after there was anything left to see, and told himself the same thing he'd been telling himself for 3 days, that a man in his position didn't get to keep the good things close. He only got to keep them safe, and safe, more often than not, meant far away, out past the reach of anyone who might use her to reach him. He was wrong about one thing, though he wouldn't understand it for another 15 years. Distance hadn't kept her out of his world at all. It had only given her the room to grow strong enough to walk back into it on her own terms. 18 years had a way of settling into a man without announcing themselves. Stephen noticed it mostly in small things. The extra half-second it took him to stand up from a chair, the reading glasses he now needed and refused to be seen wearing outside the study, the way his hands, once perfectly steady, had developed a faint tremor he'd trained himself to hide by keeping them in his pockets whenever he could. He was 61. He still ran the operation the way he always had, still sat at the head of every table that mattered, still commanded the kind of silence that fell over a room when he walked into it. But he'd started, without quite admitting it to himself, to lean on the people around him in ways he never used to. That was the part age took from you before it took anything else. Not your strength. Your certainty that you didn't need anyone else's. Marcus Doyle had become the person he leaned on most. It hadn't happened all at once, which was precisely how Doyle had always preferred to do things. He'd started as a quiet presence in the room 15 years earlier, the kind of man who took notes nobody asked him to take and remembered details nobody thought to track. Birthdays, grudges, which lieutenants owed favors to which suppliers. He never pushed for anything. He waited to be given it, and over the years Stephen had given him a great deal, because Doyle had never once, in 15 years, given him a reason not to. He agreed with Stephen's decisions before Stephen had finished making them. He absorbed blame when things went wrong, and deflected credit when things went right. He was, by every measure Stephen knew how to take, the most loyal man in the building. Sherry had said something about that once, years ago, standing in a doorway with her arms crossed the way she used to, when she thought she'd spotted something everyone else had missed. He agrees with you too easily, she'd told him. That's not loyalty. That's strategy. He'd waved it off then as the suspicion of a teenager who trusted no one on principle, and he still thought about it sometimes late at night, in the specific way you think about a splinter you never quite dug out. What Stephen didn't see, what he had no reason to see, because Doyle had spent 15 years making sure there was nothing to see, was the slow architecture being built underneath him. It started years back with a logistics company that existed mostly on paper, the kind of shell that moved invoices instead of goods, the kind no one thought to examine because it was boring, and boring was the one disguise that worked on everyone. Money moved through it in amounts too small to trip any wire, routed through 2 more companies just as forgettable, before landing somewhere that had nothing to do with Stephen Waller and everything to do with a set of accounts only Doyle had access to. It wasn't theft, not in any way that would show up on a ledger. It was patience, dressed up as competence, waiting for the moment it would matter. The prosecutor's name was Diane Ashford, and she'd spent 11 years working federal organized crime cases without landing the one that would make her career. She was smart, ambitious in the specific hungry way that made people underestimate how far she'd go, and she'd built a reputation as someone who didn't lose cases she chose to bring, mostly because she was careful about which cases she chose. She'd looked at Stephen Waller's operation twice in the past decade, and walked away both times, unwilling to build a case on evidence too thin to survive a defense attorney worth the name. Doyle found her at a bar association dinner neither of them had any real business attending, and the conversation that started there took the better part of a year to become anything at all. He never offered her anything as crude as evidence, not at first. He offered patience, and information delivered in pieces small enough to feel incidental, a shipment date here, a name there, nothing that couldn't be explained away as gossip if either of them ever needed to walk it back. It was months before Ashford understood what she was actually being handed. By then she wanted it badly enough not to ask too many questions about who was handing it to her, or why. Stephen felt none of this happening. He felt, if anything, more secure than he had in years. The operation running smoothly, Doyle handling the details. Stephen no longer had the patience to chase down himself, the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he'd finally built something stable enough to outlast him. He thought about Sherry more often than he used to, now that there was less urgent business to fill the space where those thoughts used to sit. She called most Sundays, sharper each year, deep into a law career that had already made her name in rooms far from his. He was proud of her in a way he rarely let himself feel proud of anything, and some nights, alone in the study with the lights off, he let himself imagine a version of the future where the empire he'd built didn't need defending at all, where she never had to know how deep its foundations really ran. He had no way of knowing, sitting in that quiet room, that the foundation was already cracking beneath him, one patient transaction at a time, and that the crack had a name he trusted completely. The morning it happened, Stephen was at the kitchen table with coffee going cold in front of him, reading a shipping manifest he'd read a dozen times before out of habit more than necessity, when the front gate camera showed him more vehicles than he'd seen in one place since a funeral. He knew before anyone said a word. 30 years of reading rooms had taught him to read arrivals too, and this one had the shape of something final. They came through the front door with a warrant and enough agents to make resistance pointless, even if resistance had ever been his style, which it wasn't. He stood with his hands already raised before anyone told him to, the old instinct kicking in ahead of the newer, angrier one, and let them cuff him in his own front hall while Reyes stood pinned against the wall by 2 agents twice his age and half his experience, unable to do anything but watch. Stephen caught his eye once, just before they walked him out, and gave the smallest shake of his head. Don't. Whatever you're thinking, don't. It wasn't a fight worth either of them dying in. The charges, when his lawyer finally read them to him in a holding room that smelled like bleach and old coffee, took 11 minutes to get through. Racketeering. Conspiracy. 2 counts of money laundering tied to accounts he didn't recognize, moving through companies whose names meant nothing to him. Witness tampering, built around a conversation he was fairly certain he'd never had, with a supplier he was fairly certain had never worked for him at all. He listened to all of it with a stillness that unsettled even his own lawyer, a stillness that had less to do with calm than with the particular, sinking clarity of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. This wasn't an investigation that had simply found him. This was a case that had been built, brick by brick, by someone who knew exactly where the walls of his operation actually were. "Where's Doyle?" he said, once the reading was finished. It wasn't really a question. "We haven't been able to reach him," the lawyer said. "Since yesterday." He absorbed that the way he'd absorbed everything else in the room, without visible reaction, filing it into a place he'd deal with later, because right now there wasn't room for anything but the immediate math. Bail was denied within the week. Flight risk, the judge said, reading from a prosecutor's filing thick enough to require 2 hands, and Stephen sat through the hearing watching Diane Ashford lay out a case with a fluency that told him she'd had a great deal of help building it, help that went far beyond what any prosecutor got handed by accident. What followed in the weeks after was worse than the arrest itself, in its own quiet way. Men he'd trusted for decades stopped returning calls. 2 of his longest-standing lieutenants, men who'd have taken a bullet for him without discussion a year earlier, suddenly couldn't be found by anyone, their apartments cleared out overnight, their families gone with them, the kind of disappearing that only happened when someone had made them an offer they understood not to refuse. A 3rd turned up not missing but talking, his name listed on a witness roster his own lawyer showed him with a grim, apologetic silence, testimony that placed Stephen at meetings he'd never attended, describing conversations that had never taken place, delivered with a specific, rehearsed confidence of a man who'd been given a script and enough incentive to memorize it well. His accountant, a soft, nervous man named Ellery who'd kept his books clean for 11 years, was found to have signed off on the very shell companies the prosecution was using as the backbone of its laundering case, signatures Stephen had never seen him make, on documents Stephen had never seen at all, dated to meetings that existed only on paper. When his lawyer finally tracked Ellery down for a statement, the man wouldn't take the call. 2 days later, his lawyer told Stephen, carefully, that Ellery had accepted a plea arrangement and would be testifying for the prosecution. By the 3rd week, sitting in a cell that had stopped feeling temporary, Stephen understood the shape of what had been built around him, even if he couldn't yet see every hand that had built it. It wasn't a case assembled from real evidence, because there wasn't any real evidence to assemble. His operation had run too carefully for too long to leave that kind of trail. It was a case assembled from forgery and fear, documents manufactured to look like history, witnesses purchased or frightened into becoming history's narrators. Someone had spent years laying this groundwork, patient enough to make it look inevitable rather than engineered, and had waited until every loyal voice that might have contradicted it had either vanished or been turned. He thought about Doyle more than anyone else in those weeks, turning the 15 years over in his mind, looking for the moment he should have seen it and hadn't. He thought, 2. About something Sherry had said to him once, years ago, in a doorway, arms crossed, 16 years old and certain of a thing he'd refused to hear. He agrees with you too easily. That's not loyalty. That's strategy. He hadn't listened. He understood now, sitting alone in a cell with a case built entirely to bury him, exactly what that failure had cost. Sherry was in the middle of closing arguments preparation, red pen in hand, 3 exhibits spread across her desk in the particular chaos that only made sense to her when her phone lit up with a number she hadn't seen in years. She almost let it go to voicemail. She almost let a lot of things go to voicemail that week, deep as she was in a trial that mattered to her career, in ways she'd spent a decade building toward, and for half a second the old habit won out, the one that said whatever this was, it could wait until after the verdict came in. Something made her pick it up anyway. She'd think about that later, the half-second decision that changed everything after it, and never quite land on what had actually tipped her hand. It was Reyes. She hadn't heard his voice in 6 years. Not since the last time she'd been back to the city for a visit that had felt, even then, like a formality neither of them fully believed in anymore. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, which told her everything before he said a word. Reyes had never called just to talk. They took him this morning, he said. Raid. Full warrant. Racketeering, laundering, conspiracy, the whole file. Bail's already been denied. She sat very still, pen frozen over the exhibit she'd been marking, and felt something in her chest do the specific, familiar thing it used to do in that house whenever the black car pulled into the drive without warning. Who's representing him? Court appointed for now. His usual guys tangled up with a conflict he won't explain. Stephen told me not to call you. A pause, heavy enough to carry across the line. I called you anyway. She didn't answer right away. 10 years of legal training had taught her to sit with silence, to let it do work before she filled it with words she'd regret, and she used all of it now, staring at exhibits that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The reasonable version of her, the version who'd built a career 3 states away specifically so she'd never have to stand in a courtroom connected to that name again, was already assembling the argument for staying exactly where she was. She had a trial of her own starting Monday. She had a firm that had made her name synonymous with careful, deliberate, winning cases, built one at a time, with no room in any of it for the words Mafia boss attached to her own. She had spent 18 years constructing a version of herself that existed entirely outside that world, and every professional instinct she owned was telling her that walking back into it now, publicly, as his lawyer, would undo more than a decade of exactly that work in a single news cycle. She thought, too, about the last real conversation they'd had, 2 years back, over a phone call that had run long and gone quiet in places neither of them knew how to fill. He'd asked her, carefully, the way he asked about most things that mattered to him, whether she was happy. She'd told him yes, mostly meaning it, and he'd said something back she hadn't fully understood until this exact moment, sitting at her desk with Reyes's voice still in her ear. You built something they can't take from you. That's the whole point of everything I did. She thought about that sentence for exactly as long as it took her to close the file in front of her and reach for her laptop. Send me everything you have, she told Reyes. The warrant, the charges, whatever the court-appointed attorneys filed so far. Everything. You're coming back. I'm coming back. There was a pause on the line she recognized, the particular kind Reyes used when he was deciding whether to say something he wasn't sure he had the right to say. He's not going to want you anywhere near this. You know that. I know that, she said. It doesn't change anything. She booked the first flight out for the following morning, a 6 a.m. departure that gave her exactly enough time to email her firm a leave request she didn't bother explaining in detail, reschedule the trial she'd spent months preparing for, and pack a bag with the efficient, joyless speed of someone who'd done this exact kind of leaving once before, 18 years earlier, in the opposite direction. She didn't sleep. She spent the night at her kitchen table with the warrant Reyes had sent her, reading it the way she read everything that mattered, twice fast, then slow, marking every place the story didn't hold together, every witness whose account arrived too clean, too convenient, too perfectly shaped to fill exactly the gaps the prosecution needed filled. By the time the sun came up, she had 4 pages of notes and a growing, cold certainty that this wasn't a case built on evidence at all. It was a case built on someone's patience, and she intended to find out exactly whose. She thought, boarding a plane, about the girl she'd been under that bridge 18 years ago, refusing money from a stranger because she'd learned the hard way that people only gave you things they expected back. She'd spent her whole life since then making sure she never owed anyone a debt she couldn't repay in full. This was the one debt she'd been waiting her entire adult life for the chance to pay. The courtroom filled the way courtrooms fill for cases that promise blood, early, and packed past what the benches were built for. Reporters lined the back wall 3 deep. Sketch artists claimed the good seats along the aisle, and somewhere in the gallery sat men Stephen recognized from 30 years of careful business, watching to see whether the empire they'd built their own lives around was about to become a cautionary tale. He sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit quite right, 3 weeks of confinement having taken more off him than he wanted to admit, and let his court-appointed attorney arrange the papers in front of him with the nervous precision of a man who already knew he was outmatched. Diane Ashford opened with the kind of confidence that only came from a prosecutor who knew exactly how strong her hand was. She walked the jury through the shell companies one at a time, laid the paper trail out like a map with no wrong turns, called it what 18 months of careful work had made it look like, an empire built on fear, finally coming apart under the weight of its own crimes. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every document she introduced had been built for precisely this moment, forged with enough patience that it read, on paper, exactly like the truth. Stephen's attorney did what he could, which wasn't much. He was a decent lawyer handling a case built by people who'd spent years anticipating every objection he might raise, and by the second day it was clear to everyone in the room, including Stephen himself, that decent wasn't going to be enough. Witnesses took the stand and delivered testimony polished to a shine no honest memory ever achieved, dates that lined up too neatly, conversations recounted almost word for word, the kind of certainty that came from rehearsal rather than recollection. His own accountant sat in that chair and described meetings that had never happened with a straight face, and Stephen watched him do it, without any visible reaction at all, because reacting would have meant admitting how much it still cost him to watch a man he'd trusted for 11 years read from someone else's script. He didn't look for Doyle's name in the gallery. He'd already stopped expecting to see it there. By the 4th day, something had settled into Stephen that felt less like fear than like arithmetic finally resolving. He'd run enough operations, made enough calculated bets, to recognize a losing position when he was sitting inside one, and this was as losing as positions came. No witnesses left who'd tell the truth, no paper trail that hadn't been manufactured against him, no lawyer in the room with the tools to unmake 18 months of careful construction in the handful of days the trial had left to run. He sat through Ashford's 4th witness with his hands folded on the table and something close to peace settling over him, the specific, resigned stillness of a man who decided the fight was already lost and was simply waiting, now, for the room to catch up to what he already knew. It was during the recess before the 5th day session, the gallery still filling, the jury not yet seated, that the doors at the back of the courtroom opened with more force than courtroom doors were generally opened, and every head in the room turned at once. She came down the center aisle in a suit the color of something that hadn't existed anywhere near his old life, an evidence folder held against her side like it weighed more than it looked like it should, and for one full second Stephen didn't recognize the woman walking toward him at all. Then he did, and something in his chest did a thing it hadn't done in 3 weeks of sitting in that cell believing there was nothing left to feel. "Your Honor," she said, before she'd even reached the defense table, her voice carrying the specific, unshaken clarity of someone who'd walked into far worse rooms than this one and come out the other side. Sherry Lang, entering my appearance as lead counsel for the defense. "I'll need a brief continuance to review discovery my client's prior counsel hasn't had adequate time to process." The judge, visibly caught off guard, looked between her and the court-appointed attorney, now half rising from his chair with an expression that mixed relief and disbelief in equal measure. Ashford was already on her feet, objecting to the delay, but Sherry didn't so much as glance her way, because her attention, for that first long moment, was entirely on the man at the defense table, watching her with an expression he hadn't let anyone in that courtroom see in 3 weeks. "Dad," she said, quiet enough that only the front rows caught it. "I'm here." He didn't trust himself to answer right away. 3 decades of never letting anyone see him rattled held for exactly as long as it took her to sit down beside him, set the folder on the table between them, and place one hand briefly over his, a gesture that lasted a second, maybe 2, and told him more than any argument she was about to make in that room. "You shouldn't have come," he said finally, low enough that it wouldn't carry. "You didn't ask me to," she said, opening the folder. "I came anyway. That's how this works now." For the first time in 3 weeks, watching her lay out pages he didn't yet understand the significance of, Stephen Waller let himself believe the fight might not be over after all. The continuance bought her 3 days, and she used every hour of it the way she'd learned to use time under pressure back in that house, where a wrong move never got a second chance. She didn't sleep more than a handful of hours across those 3 days. She read every document Ashford's office had turned over, then read it again, this time not for what it said but for what it was trying too hard to say. The places where a paper trail had been built to look inevitable instead of simply being inevitable. The small tells that 18 years around men who lied for a living had taught her to spot faster than any professor ever could. By the time she walked back into that courtroom, she wasn't carrying a defense strategy built entirely out of a law degree. She was carrying one built out of both lives she'd ever lived, stitched together into something the prosecution hadn't prepared for because it hadn't occurred to them such a thing could exist. She started with the accountant. Ellery took the stand with the same rehearsed calm he'd shown all week, ready for the same gentle, overmatched cross-examination the court-appointed attorney would have offered him. Sherry didn't raise her voice.
She didn't need to.
She walked him, slowly and without any apparent urgency, through the exact dates on the documents bearing his signature, then asked him, just as calmly, to describe his handwriting habits, whether he dated documents before or after signing them, whether he used a particular pen for anything going to the state, small mechanical details that meant nothing to the jury until she produced 3 earlier filings, pulled from a decade of public record, showing a dating convention that didn't match a single signature Ashford had entered into evidence. Ellery's composure didn't crack all at once. It went the way ice goes, a hairline first, then a widening, until by the end of 40 minutes he was contradicting his own earlier testimony without seeming to notice he'd done it. She moved through the other witnesses with the same patient precision, never raising her voice, never performing outrage for the jury the way lesser attorneys might have. She'd learned patience from a man who'd once told her that anger was a tool amateurs reached for because they hadn't learned to use anything sharper. Each witness who claimed to have overheard a conversation, attended a meeting, witnessed an exchange, found themselves walked carefully into a timeline that didn't hold. A supplier present at a meeting the shipping logs placed 3 states away that same afternoon, a lieutenant recalling a conversation about a shipment that hadn't existed under the name he used for it until 8 months after he claimed the conversation took place. None of it was theater. It was arithmetic, laid out one quiet correction at a time, until the jury began to see the same shape Sherry had seen reading those files at 2 in the morning, not a criminal enterprise unraveling under its own weight, but a case constructed, piece by patient piece, by someone who'd had years to get the details right and still hadn't gotten all of them right enough. Ashford fought for every inch of it, objecting where she could, working to rehabilitate witnesses on redirect with the sharp, practiced instincts of a prosecutor who hadn't lost a case she'd chosen to bring. But something in the courtroom had shifted, and both women knew it. The jury that had watched Ashford's case unfold in the first days with the flat, accepting attention of people being told an obvious truth, was now leaning forward for a different reason, the specific attention of people who'd started to suspect they were being shown something built rather than something real. The turning point came on the 3rd witness of the second day, a mid-level lieutenant named Foss who'd been given immunity in exchange for testimony placing Stephen at the center of a laundering scheme running through the shell companies. Sherry walked him, gently at first, through the specifics of his immunity deal, then asked him, still gently, still without any edge in her voice, who had first approached him about testifying. Foss hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a second, but Sherry had spent 18 years in a house built on reading exactly that kind of second, and she didn't let it pass. "Take your time," she said. Who approached you first? Foss looked toward the prosecution table, then away from it, and in that single, unguarded look the entire courtroom understood he was about to say something Ashford hadn't prepared him to say. It wasn't the state, he said finally. Not at first. Somebody came to me before any of this started. Told me what to say, what dates to use. Said it'd all line up once the charges came down. The gallery went still in the particular way courtrooms go still right before everyone in the room realizes they're watching the actual story instead of the one they were told to expect. And who is that? Sherry asked, quiet, patient, already knowing the answer before he gave it. Who came to you first? Foss's eyes went to the back of the courtroom, toward a door that had been closed all week, and for the first time since she'd walked in, Stephen Waller sat forward in his chair. Marcus Doyle, Foss said, and the name landed in that courtroom like something physical. A weight dropped into a room that had spent 8 days believing it already knew the shape of the truth. Ashford was on her feet immediately, objecting, working to contain a witness who'd just stepped outside the boundaries of his own testimony, but the damage had already found its way into the jury box, and no objection was going to pull it back out. Sherry didn't press further in that moment. She'd learned, in a house full of men who understood the value of restraint, that the most damaging thing you could do to a lie was simply let it sit in a room long enough for people to look at it directly. She thanked Foss, said she had nothing further, and sat back down beside her father with a stillness that gave away nothing of what she'd been building toward for 3 sleepless nights. It took 2 more days to finish the work. A financial analyst she'd retained on her own dime walked the jury through the shell company's actual ownership trail, a trail Sherry had traced back not through subpoenaed records, but through the kind of patient, informal knowledge she'd absorbed as a child without ever meaning to, which accounts had which signatories, which names appeared on paperwork nobody was supposed to read closely. Details she'd filed away at 11 years old without understanding why, and carried for 18 years, without ever expecting to need. The accounts led, every one of them, back to a set of holdings controlled not by Stephen Waller, but by a man who'd spent 15 years making himself indispensable to a family he'd never actually belonged to. Doyle wasn't in the courtroom when Foss said his name, but he was there 3 days later, subpoenaed by Sherry's motion and unable, this time, to find a reason not to show. He took the stand with the same calm, agreeable composure he'd worn for 15 years in Stephen's house, the same soft voice that had never once, in all that time, raised itself in disagreement. Sherry let him keep that composure for exactly as long as it took her to lay the financial trail out in front of him, document by document, each one a small brick in a wall he'd built too carefully to notice he'd left fingerprints on every piece of it. He held the calm through the first hour. He held it through most of the second. It was a signature, his own, on a filing he'd forgotten existed, dated 3 years before the case had ever been built, that finally cracked something in him the jury could see happening in real time, the specific unraveling of a man who'd spent so long believing his own patience made him untouchable that he'd stopped preparing for the possibility someone might actually catch up to him. He didn't confess, not outright. He didn't need to. The jury had watched enough by then to draw the line themselves, and when Sherry asked her final question, whether he'd ever discussed the shell companies with Diane Ashford before the investigation formally began, his hesitation answered it as clearly as any words could have. The verdict, when it came 4 days later, took the jury under 3 hours to reach. Not guilty on every count, read out in a courtroom so quiet Stephen could hear his own heartbeat in the pause before the word actually landed. He didn't move for a long moment after it did, the way a man doesn't move right away when a weight he's been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing it is finally, suddenly gone. Doyle was taken into custody before he made it out of the building, agents who'd been quietly building their own case against him for the better part of a week finally closing and once his testimony gave them what they needed. He didn't look at Stephen on his way out. He didn't look at anyone. Sherry watched him go with an expression that wasn't triumph, exactly, closer to the quiet, tired satisfaction of a debt finally settled after 18 years of carrying it unpaid. Outside, the cameras were waiting the way they always waited for endings like this one, and Stephen stood at the top of the courthouse steps for a moment, blinking into daylight he hadn't properly stood in for over a month, before he turned to the woman beside him. You didn't have to come back for this, he said. You built a life that had nothing to do with any of it. I made sure of that. You made sure I had somewhere to build a life from, she said. That's not the same thing as nothing to do with it. He didn't have an answer ready for that, which had become, over 18 years, one of the more reliable signs that she was right about something. They walked down the steps together, past the cameras, past the reporters shouting questions neither of them planned on answering that day, and for the first time since a January night 20 years ago wedged between a dumpster and a brick wall, Stephen Waller understood what he'd actually built by choosing to stop that night instead of walking past it. Not an empire that needed defending from the world. A daughter who'd walked back into the fire on her own, not because she owed him anything, but because somewhere in that house full of hard men and harder rules, she decided a long time ago that this was hers to protect too.